My twin brother called me at 2 in the morning, and he was crying. Not the kind of crying you hear when someone loses a job or when a dog dies. This was different. This was the kind of crying that sounds like a man whose soul has been slowly removed from his body, piece by piece, over a very long time. He could barely speak, and when he finally did, he only said one thing. "She won't let me leave, Marcus. She's never gonna let me leave." I sat straight up in bed. My heart was pounding, because in that moment, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I hadn't heard my brother's real laugh in over 5 years.
Here's what you need to understand before I tell you the rest of this story. My brother Daniel had been married for 11 years. 11 years. And in that entire time, I had slowly, quietly, almost painlessly lost him. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just gradually. The way a photograph fades when you leave it in the sun too long. You don't notice it day by day. But one morning you pick it up and realize, this isn't even the same picture anymore. His wife's name was Claire. And for 11 years, I watched her do something that I didn't even have a word for back then. I just knew it felt wrong. I knew something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was just how bad things had gotten inside that house. Not until that 2 a.m. phone call. Not until I did what I did next. Daniel and I are identical twins. And I mean truly identical. The kind where our own mother had to paint a small red dot on my left thumbnail when we were babies just to tell us apart. The kind where strangers would stop us on the street and stare like we were some kind of optical illusion. We shared everything growing up. Same room, same clothes, same group of friends, same way of laughing, same way of tilting our heads when we were confused, same unconscious habit of cracking our knuckles before we said something important. There was a closeness between us that I don't think I could ever fully explain to someone who doesn't have a twin. It's not just that you're best friends. It's that you have a built-in mirror for your entire life. Someone who has always known you, every single version of you, without explanation or apology. You don't have to earn that relationship. You were born into it. We grew up in Columbus, Ohio. Middle-class family. Dad was an electrician. Mom worked at the school district. Normal, quiet, good life. Daniel was always the slightly more serious one. More methodical, more careful. I was the one who talked too much and made friends everywhere. But we balanced each other out perfectly. Then we went to the same college. Got our own apartments in the same city. Called each other every few days. Life was good. And then, when we were 26, Daniel met Claire. I remember the night he brought her to meet me. We went to this little Italian restaurant downtown, the kind with the red checkered tablecloths. She was beautiful, bright smile, really sharp eyes, confident the way some people just naturally are. She did most of the talking that night, which I thought was just nerves or personality. Daniel sat next to her, smiling, adding small details here and there when she paused. I liked her. I genuinely liked her. But something, I don't even know what to call it, some quiet, wordless instinct, made me feel slightly uncomfortable by the end of the night. I couldn't name it. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was just being protective. They got married 18 months later. And then, slowly, quietly, my brother started disappearing. It started small. The way these things always do. The first thing I noticed was that Daniel stopped calling as often. Which, okay, you get married, life gets busy, that's normal. I understood that. But then he stopped answering when I called. And when I'd finally reach him, he always sounded measured. Like every word was being carefully selected before it left his mouth. I remember calling him one afternoon, must have been about a year into the marriage. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. And then I heard Claire's voice in the background. "Daniel, who are you talking to?" "Just Marcus," he said, and his voice had already changed. "Tell him you'll call back. We have to leave in 20 minutes. He told me he'd call back. He didn't. And that, I told myself, was just marriage. People get busy. I needed to stop being so sensitive. But then came the holiday. Thanksgiving, 2 years into their marriage. We had always spent Thanksgiving at my parents' house. Always. Every year, no exceptions. It was just the kind of family tradition that you didn't question. Mom would cook for 2 days, Dad would fall asleep watching football, and Daniel and I would stay up too late playing cards like we were teenagers again. That year, Daniel didn't come. Claire had made plans with her side of the family in Denver, and that was that. My mom cried, but quietly, into the kitchen sink where she thought nobody could hear her. I heard her. I told myself, it's her family too. That's fair. That's marriage. But the year after that, they didn't come again. Or the year after that. I started to notice that whenever I did see my brother, at the rare birthday or backyard barbecue, Claire was always there. Right there. Not in an affectionate way, exactly. More like a supervisor. She had this very particular way of touching his arm when he said something she wanted to redirect. A light, almost imperceptible pressure. And Daniel would pause, mid-sentence, and change what he was saying. I noticed. I always noticed. But I told myself I was reading too much into it. Then I found out about the phone. A mutual friend of ours, a guy we'd known since high school, ran into Daniel at a gas station and tried to give him his new number. Daniel pulled out his phone to save it, and our friend noticed something strange. He told me about it later. His phone had no apps on it, Marcus. No social media, no email app, nothing. And there was a passcode lock that he was weirdly nervous about even just unlocking. Well, maybe he's just private, I said. He looked over his shoulder, my friend told me. Twice, just to save a phone number. I went home that night and called Daniel. I asked him directly, hey, are you doing all right? Like, actually all right. He said, of course. Why wouldn't I be? And something in his voice, that careful, measured, selected quality, it made my chest ache. Because I had known that voice my entire life. And the man speaking to me didn't sound like my brother anymore. He sounded like a man who had been rehearsed. Then came the phone call. It was a Tuesday, 2:14 in the morning. I know the exact time because I took a screenshot of it immediately, almost on instinct, like some part of me knew this moment would matter later. His voice was broken. He had clearly been crying for a long time before he decided to call me. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt. And piece by piece, through pauses and long silences and the kind of shame that makes a person's voice shake, he told me things that made me feel sick to my stomach. He didn't have his own bank account. Not anymore. 3 years in a marriage, Claire had suggested they consolidate everything into a joint account, and he'd agreed because that seemed reasonable for a married couple. But then, slowly, access to that account had become complicated. She managed the account. She handled the bills. He was given a weekly household allowance, her word, that he had to account for, with receipts. He was not permitted to have his own credit card. He was not permitted to make purchases over $50 without telling her first. He asked me, in a voice so quiet I had to press the phone against my ear, is this normal, Marcus? Do married couples do this? And I felt something inside me harden like concrete. No, this was not normal. This was not marriage. This was a cage. After that call, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, running through everything. All the small things that individually I had explained away. The missed holidays, the careful voice, the supervised conversations, the over-the-shoulder glances, the managed money, the rehearsed answers. And I started to see what I should have seen years ago. Not just a controlling person, a system, a carefully maintained, deliberately constructed system of control designed to keep one person small and dependent and isolated, while appearing completely normal to the outside world. I knew I had to do something. I just didn't know what. The next morning, I started paying attention differently. I drove past their neighborhood. I watched their routine. When Claire left for work, when she came home, when she went to the grocery store. I started taking notes. Not obsessively, just observing. And the more I observed, the more a thought began to form in the back of my mind. A thought that was either completely brilliant or completely insane. We were identical twins. Truly, perfectly identical. We had fooled people our entire lives. Teachers, coaches, strangers. We had switched places as a joke dozens of times when we were kids. It was always effortless. Because when you have someone's face, you only need to borrow their mannerisms. And I knew my brother's mannerisms better than I knew my own. What if I could see inside that house? Not as a visitor, not as the brother-in-law she would put on her best performance for, but as Daniel, for the inside. I know how that sounds. I know. But I want you to understand the alternative. My brother calling me at 2 in the morning, 10 years from now, still asking me if this is normal. I called him back and told him my plan. There was a long silence on the other end. And then he said, "She'll know." And I said, "She won't." We spent 2 weeks preparing. I know that sounds dramatic, but this had to be perfect. One wrong word, one wrong habit, one small detail out of place, and she would know immediately. Or worse, she would suspect, and Daniel would pay for it long after I was gone. Daniel told me everything, their daily routine, down to the minute. What time he woke up, how he took his coffee, 2 sugars, no cream, in the blue mug on the left side of the cabinet, which side of the bed, what topics were safe to bring up, and, more importantly, which ones weren't. The way he answered her questions, the pace of his walk, the slight forward tilt of his head when she was speaking. He told me about the rules. And my God, there were so many rules. No phone calls without telling her first. No going out without a stated reason and estimated return time. Meals were on a schedule. Spending was tracked in a notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. Friends were referred to in the past tense because there weren't any left. I practiced everything. I cut my hair the way Daniel wore his. I wore his clothes. I studied the photos on his phone, the ones Claire had taken of him, just to memorize his posture. Because posture is always the thing that gives twins away. The plan was simple. Daniel would tell Claire that he needed to visit our mother, who had been having some health concerns, which was half true. She'd had a knee procedure recently. He would leave for the weekend. I would arrive in his place. 3 days. That was all I needed. 3 days to see what my brother had been living with for 11 years. That I pulled into their driveway on a Friday evening around 6 o'clock. My palms were sweating. My heart was going so fast, I could feel it in my temples. I took 3 slow breaths. I cracked my knuckles, Daniel's habit, now mine, and I walked to the front door. She opened it before I could even reach for the handle. Claire was standing there in a light gray sweater, arms crossed loosely, with that particular expression on her face. Not quite a smile, not quite neutral. Evaluating, like a teacher who's already graded you before you've handed him the test. "You're 11 minutes late," she said. Not hello, not welcome home. "Traffic on the highway," I said. Kept my voice low, kept my eyes down slightly the way Daniel had described. "Sorry." She looked at me for a moment. Then she stepped aside. I walked into that house and felt the air change. It wasn't cold exactly, but it wasn't warm either. It was organized, almost aggressively organized. Everything in its place, every surface clear, every picture perfectly leveled. The kind of order that isn't just preference, it's control. "Dinner's at 7, she said from behind me. "Don't leave your bag in the hallway." I moved the bag. The first night was almost manageable. She was civil over dinner. She talked about her week, a work project, a conflict with a colleague she'd handled decisively, a neighbor who'd parked too close to their driveway. I listened. I nodded. I said the right small things at the right small moments. Daniel had prepped me well, but I noticed how she ate. Slowly, deliberately, watching me the entire time. Not in a loving way, in the way you watch someone you're monitoring. And I noticed that when I reached for a second dinner roll, she said, very quietly, "You already had one." Just that. Just 3 words. And I looked up and her eyes were steady and certain, and I understood immediately. This wasn't a comment. It was a boundary, being drawn in real time. About a dinner roll. I put it back. Daniel would have put it back. So I put it back. That night, after she went to sleep, I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about my brother in this room, in this silence, every night for 11 years. And something in my chest felt like it was being slowly compressed. The second day was when things got darker. I made the mistake of going out to the garage in the morning to get some air, just standing outside for a few minutes, and she appeared at the door within 60 seconds. "Where are you going?" "Just getting some air," I said. "You didn't say you were going outside." I turned around. I didn't know I needed to. Her expression shifted. Something cooled behind her eyes. "I'd just like to know where you are, Daniel." "Is that so unreasonable?" She said it in the most reasonable tone of voice I have ever heard. That's the thing that's hard to describe. It always sounded reasonable. Every single boundary, every single limitation, every piece of monitoring, all delivered in a calm, reasonable, measured voice. The voice of someone who has been very carefully trained to sound like they're being perfectly logical while systematically dismantling another person's autonomy. No, I said, that's not unreasonable. And I went back inside. That afternoon, I watched her go through Daniel's notebook, the spending log, while he supposedly wasn't looking. Except he was. I was. I watched her run her finger down every line, cross-referencing it against something on her phone. When she found an entry she didn't recognize, $3.40 at a vending machine, she set the notebook down and waited. She didn't say anything. She just waited, and I understood that Daniel would have felt that silence. He would have known he'd need to explain it. He'd have come in, seen her face, felt the frost, and immediately gone into a kind of internal emergency mode, trying to remember what he'd done, what she'd found, what he'd need to say to defuse it. $3.40 at a vending machine, and she made the entire house feel like an interrogation room. I sat down at the kitchen table and said, calmly, I got a Gatorade after the gym on Wednesday. I forgot to write it down. I'm sorry. She looked at me for a moment. Just write it down next time, she said. That's all I ask. And she smiled, like she was being generous. That night, I called Daniel from the bathroom with the faucet running. I told him what I was seeing. His response was almost worse than anything she had done. Yeah, he said. That's a normal week. A normal week, the third day. Sunday. I had seen enough. I had documented enough. I'd been quietly recording conversations on my phone with Daniel's knowledge and permission because we both understood we might need that later. I had seen the spending log, heard the tone, felt the silence used as a weapon. I had experienced just 72 hours of what Daniel had lived through for 11 years. And I was done. I decided I wasn't going to leave that house the same way I came in. We had agreed, originally, that I would keep my cover until Daniel returned, and we'd figure out the next steps calmly, together, with maybe a counselor or a lawyer involved. That was the plan. But Sunday morning, something happened that changed everything. She went through his phone. I had left it on the kitchen counter charging. Standard thing. And I came back into the kitchen to find her standing there, scrolling through it. She didn't hear me come in, and I stood in the doorway and watched her read through his text messages, my text messages, with a calm, systematic focus that made my skin crawl. She came across something from our mother. A text from 2 days ago. Tell Marcus I said hello. Miss you both. She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on the counter and turned around and almost walked directly into me. Her composure was extraordinary. She didn't flinch. She said, Your mother texted. I know, I said. I saw it. She mentioned Marcus. She usually does. She said to tell him hello. There was something in her voice now, some tiny tremor underneath all that control. Like you've been talking to him. I talk to my brother sometimes, Claire. You told me you hadn't spoken to him in weeks. And that was Daniel's doing. He'd apparently told her that to avoid the interrogation that came every time he talked to me. He'd made himself small enough to avoid the friction. And now I was standing in that kitchen, having just been caught in a version of his lie, and I made a decision. I straightened up. Not Daniel straight. Marcus straight. My own way of standing. My own full height. And I said, Claire, I'm not Daniel. The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever been inside of. Her face went completely still. What? My name is Marcus. I'm Daniel's brother, and I have spent the last 3 days inside this house watching how you treat him. And I need you to hear something. She didn't move. She just stared at me. And for the first time, maybe the first time in 11 years with either me or my brother, she looked like someone who had lost control of the situation. You what? You can't. I can, I did. And Daniel is safe, and he's coming home today. But before he does, we're going to have a conversation. Her face cycled through shock, then fury, then something that almost looked like fear. Real fear. Because she had been operating in a closed system for 11 years, a controlled environment where she was the only authority. And now the walls had come down, and someone from outside had seen everything. You had no right, she said. Her voice was shaking now. You've spent 11 years treating my brother like a child who needs to be managed, I said. Controlling his money, his phone, his friendships, his meals, his movements. He asked your permission to exist in his own home. He apologizes for vending machine purchases. He stopped coming to his own mother's house for Thanksgiving because you decided that for him. I was here, Claire. I saw it. I recorded it. That last word landed like a stone in still water. Her face went white. What did you just say? I said I recorded it. 3 days of conversations. The spending log. The phone monitoring. The tracking. All of it. Daniel arrived home 2 hours later. He walked in the front door and stopped when he saw us both sitting at the kitchen table. Me on one side, Claire on the other, the space between us filled with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. He looked at her. Then he looked at me. It's done, he asked me quietly. It's done, I said. What happened in the months that followed was not dramatic in the way movies want things to be dramatic. There was no single explosion. There was no screaming, no thrown dishes, no villain speech. Life, real life, is rarely that clean. What there was, a separation. Daniel moved out 3 weeks after that Sunday. He stayed with me for the first few months. He had to rebuild almost everything from scratch. Bank accounts, a phone plan, a sense of what he was allowed to do in a given day without asking anyone's permission. That last part took the longest. Habits forged over a decade don't disappear in 3 weeks. Or 3 months. I watched my brother relearn how to live. He called an old friend one afternoon, a guy we'd grown up with who Daniel hadn't spoken to in 6 years, and he sat at my kitchen table and talked to him for 2 hours, and when he hung up, he just sat there quietly for a long moment, and then he said, I forgot how much I missed him, and I had to leave the room because I didn't want him to see me cry. Claire contested the separation, of course. She had responses for everything, reframings, alternative explanations, a portrait of herself as a concerned and misunderstood partner who simply had high standards for how a household should be run. Her family believed her. Some of their mutual acquaintances believed her. That's what happens with someone who has spent years carefully managing their image. But the recordings existed. Daniel's attorney. He had his own attorney now, because he had his own money now, because he had his own bank account now, presented everything in mediation. The financial control. The documented monitoring, the isolation from family, the systematic erosion of his independence over 11 years. Claire sat in that room, and for the first time in the entirety of her knowledge of her, she had nothing to say. The settlement was finalized 8 months after that 2 a.m. phone call, and the day it was signed, Daniel called me. He was laughing, not a performance, not a careful, measured, selected approximation of happiness. A real laugh. His actual laugh, the one I hadn't heard in 5 years, the one that sounds slightly too loud and ends with a little snort that he's been embarrassed about his entire life. I laughed too, probably harder than the moment required, because that laugh, that specific, ridiculous, too loud, snorting laugh, was my brother. The actual one, the whole one. He was back. Here's the part of the story I didn't expect. About 4 months after the separation, Daniel came to me with something he'd discovered while going through old financial records. Something he hadn't known. Something Claire had kept very carefully hidden. There was a second account. Not their joint account. A private account. In Claire's name alone. An account that had been receiving automatic transfers. Small ones. $50 here, $80 there. From her joint account, recategorized in the ledger under household expenses. 11 years of small transfers. Over $42,000. Daniel had been given a $50 weekly allowance and told to provide receipts, while every month she had been quietly, methodically moving money into her private account, all while managing the finances, all while keeping him from having independent access. He wasn't just controlled. He was being financially drained by the person doing the controlling. His attorney said it was one of the cleaner cases of financial abuse he'd seen. Quiet, patient, long-term, nearly invisible without the records. I sat with that for a long time. The deliberateness of it. The years of planning it must have taken. The confidence required to maintain that system for a decade, with a person right beside you who trusted you completely. And I thought about my brother, brilliant, kind, thoughtful Daniel, who had believed for 11 years that this was simply what marriage was. That love required receipts. That freedom had to be earned through obedience. That the man he used to be had simply grown up and changed. He hadn't changed. He'd been erased. And then, slowly, piece by piece, He came back that I want to end this story the way it deserves to end. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something true. If you're watching this and something in this story feels familiar, not in the details, maybe, but in the feeling, that breathless, careful, always measuring feeling of navigating someone else's rules in your own life, I want you to hear this. That is not love. That is not what love feels like. Love doesn't require you to disappear to survive. My brother spent 11 years becoming smaller and smaller, trying to fit inside a space that was never going to be big enough for a full human being. Because it wasn't designed to be. It was designed to keep him dependent, to keep her in control, to keep the balance of power permanently, quietly, reasonably tipped in one direction. And if I had not made that phone call, if he had not made that 2 a.m. call, I don't know where he'd be today. I really don't. So if you have a Daniel in your life, a sibling, a friend, a coworker, someone who seems a little too careful, a little too measured, a little too apologetic about things that don't require an apology, say something. Ask the question. Make the call. And if you are Daniel, if you're someone who has forgotten what your own laugh sounds like, I want you to know that it is still in there. You didn't lose it. It was just waiting. It was waiting for someone to say, this is not normal. And you don't have to stay. Claire did not walk away without consequences. The financial fraud case is still ongoing. Daniel bought his own car last spring, the first car he'd ever chosen entirely by himself. He picked blue. I told him it was the most Daniel color possible. He laughed. That too loud, snorting laugh. We're okay. 30 seconds of bravery, one phone call, changed everything. Sometimes all someone needs is to hear, I see you, and I'm coming.